Look up. There is a chimney cap on that building. Cast iron, bolted into place. You have probably walked past it 1,000 times without registering it. It was not built with the building. The date on the cap is different from the date on the brick. The building breathed through that chimney for decades before anyone thought to close it. The question is when the cap was installed. And why? Because the cap is not maintenance. The cap is a termination. Whatever passed through that opening before the cap arrived has been stopped, not upgraded, and the distinction matters. This video is about that cap, not this one specifically, but the pattern it represents. 14 cities across a 15-year window passed municipal codes that prohibited, in specific technical language, the operation of systems that had been functioning in American buildings since before the Civil War. Those systems are not mysterious. The documents are public, the dates are public, and the names of the officials who signed the ordinances are a matter of record. We are going to go through them in order. Before 1900, the chimney was not a decorative feature. It was infrastructure. In residential and commercial buildings across American cities, flues served dual purposes. Combustion exhaust was one. The second was ventilation, the passive movement of air through a structure driven by thermal differential, where hot air rises, cold air enters at grade, and the building breathes without assistance from any machine. Engineers in the 1870s called this the stack effect. It required no mechanical assistance, no electricity, no recurring cost. The geometry of the building did the work. By 1880, this principle had been engineered into a second category of application. Inventors in the United States and Europe had filed patents for systems that used differential pressure across a sealed flue to do more than move air. There were 23 patents filed in the United States between 1,875 and 1,895, describing variations on this approach. The U.S. Patent Office records are available through the National Archives. These systems were not theoretical. Several were installed in real buildings, and some remain in place today, sealed beneath subsequent renovations, behind drywall, under floors, inside the chimney structures that were later capped. But in 1905, something changed, and the change was not in the buildings. It was in the paperwork around them. Chicago's building code, revised in 1905, introduced language that had not appeared in the previous version. Section 14, paragraph 3, described a category of unauthorized thermal conveyance apparatus and specified that such apparatus, if found operating within city limits, constituted a code violation subject to mandatory removal. The phrasing was technical enough that most property owners would not have recognized what was being described. The inspectors who enforced it did. The men who wrote it certainly did. The question worth sitting with is what was operating in Chicago buildings in 1905 that had not been present when the previous code was written in 1893. That question has a documented answer. The 1,893 code is 211 pages. The 1,905 revision is 289 pages. 78 pages of new language were added in 12 years. 44 of those 78 pages addressed fire safety, structural load, and electrical installation, categories that had expanded naturally with the growth of the city and the introduction of electric service. The remaining 34 pages addressed categories that had no precedent in the 1893 version, including mechanical ventilation standards, licensing requirements for the installation of thermal apparatus, and that phrase, unauthorized thermal conveyance apparatus. There is no public record of a constituent complaint that prompted these additions. No newspaper accounts describe buildings damaged by unauthorized thermal systems. The insurance claim records are silent. There are no fires, no injuries, no documented harm attributed to anything the new language was prohibiting. The ordinance appeared without a public incident to justify it. But it did not appear without context. Because in 1903, 2 years before Chicago's revision, a man named John Worrell Keeley had been dead for 5 years, and the legal proceedings around his estate were concluding. Keeley is not central to this story. He is a marker. His name appears in the engineering press of the 1890s, alongside descriptions of resonant frequency mechanics, sympathetic vibration, and the behavior of pressurized flue structures under oscillating thermal load. Whether his specific claims were valid is a separate question. What matters is that his work attracted the attention of the Philadelphia engineering community in the 1890s, and that several of his documented associates went on to file patents that used adjacent principles in ways that were not speculative. Those applications were functional, and the patent office approved them. 4 of those patent holders were operating installed systems in commercial buildings in Chicago by 1902. By 1907, 2 years after the revised code took effect, all 4 systems had been removed under municipal order. The removal orders are filed in the Chicago Department of Buildings archive. The archive is open to the public. Chicago was not first in the sequence. It was simply the most documented. The sequence had started 3 years earlier, in a city that kept worse records. Cincinnati, Omianowasuta Ordinance 7741B. The language was less precise than Chicago's. It prohibited the operation of any non-standard flue apparatus in structures classified for commercial or multi-family residential use. The definition of non-standard was left to the discretion of the building inspector. That discretion was exercised 7 times between November 1902 and March 1903. 7 removal orders, all involving the same type of installation, all in buildings along a 4-block stretch of Vine Street. The owners of those buildings had a common supplier, a small fabrication company operating out of a warehouse on Hamilton Avenue. The company's name was Meridian Thermal Works. It had been in business since 1889. Meridian Thermal Works closed in March 1903, the same month the last removal order was filed. The owner, a man named August Ruel, moved to St. Louis. There is no further record of him in Ohio public documents. But the ordinance he left behind was still in effect, and its language, with minor modifications, reappeared 18 months later in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's 1903 revision to its mechanical code is 4 pages. 8 of those pages deal with natural gas installation, which was expanding rapidly in Allegheny County at the time. The remaining 6 pages address a category called passive thermal machinery. The language defining violations is close enough to Cincinnati's ordinance that the 2 documents could have been drafted by the same office. They were not drafted by the same office. Pittsburgh's revision was attributed to the city's Bureau of Building Inspection, specifically to a senior inspector named Harold T. Marsh. Cincinnati's ordinance had been drafted by a consulting engineer whose firm, Holloway & Crane, was based in Philadelphia. Harold T. Marsh had worked at Holloway & Crane from 1896 to 1901 before taking the Pittsburgh appointment. 2 different cities, 2 documents with nearly identical language, and 1 former employee of the drafting firm serving as the connection between them. By 1906, Holloway & Crane's principals had been engaged as consultants on building code revisions in 4 additional cities: Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis, and Baltimore. In each city, The revised code contained language prohibiting passive thermal conveyance, or its equivalent. In each city, the prohibition appeared within 18 months of the firm's consulting engagement. The firm dissolved in 1911. Its two principals, William Holloway and George Crane, left no public explanation for the closure. Their client list, recovered from Philadelphia probate records in 1923, included 8 additional municipal governments that are not in the 4 named above. We are going to look at the remaining 6 cities. But first, there is something else in that probate record. Below the client list, in the same handwriting, there is a column labelled Principal Correspondence Retained. It contains 11 names, most of them city officials or engineering associations. One of them is neither. The name on the letterhead is Edison General Electric Company, and the date of the correspondence is listed as 1903. To understand what this was precisely, by 1903, Edison General Electric had already merged with Thomson Houston to become General Electric. The correspondence was retained under the predecessor company name, suggesting it originated no later than 1892 and was carried forward in the files. But the retention date in the probate record is 1903. Which means Holloway and Crane considered this correspondence active, relevant, or both, more than a decade after the merger that made the sender's company name technically obsolete. What was in that correspondence is not in the probate record. The letters themselves are not referenced in any surviving Holloway and Crane document. The only evidence that the correspondence existed is this single line in a private asset inventory from 1923. What the public record does show is this. In 1903, General Electric's primary revenue came from electrical generation, transmission, and metering equipment. Every kilowatt hour consumed by a building in an American city in 1903 was a metered billed transaction that passed through GE hardware. A building that generated or transferred usable energy through a passive non-electric system was a building that was not, to that extent, consuming metered electricity. In 1904, GE launched a sustained advertising campaign encouraging municipal governments to mandate all-electric heating and ventilation in new residential construction. The campaign materials survive in the Smithsonian Institution's collections. The campaign was not secret. It was reported in trade publications. It was discussed openly at the National Association of Builders Convention in 1905. But it ran alongside the building code revisions in the same cities in the same years. 8 cities received both a Holloway and Crane consultation and an active GE municipal campaign between 1902 and 1912. In all 8, building code language prohibiting passive thermal systems appeared within 24 months of either engagement, whichever came first. In 6 of the 8 cities, the code change came after both engagements. In the other 2, the code change came first, and the GE campaign followed within 12 months. Those 2 cities are Kansas City, Missouri, and Providence, Rhode Island. Kansas City's 1908 ordinance preceded the GE regional campaign by 11 months. The man who drafted it was a city engineer named Walter F. Coombs. Before his municipal appointment, Coombs had worked as a field engineer for Thomson Houston, GE's predecessor company, from 1889 to 1894. The thread goes back further than the campaign. The earliest code change on record is Cincinnati, 1902. The latest is Indianapolis, 1917. Across that 15-year window, 14 cities passed ordinances using language that, while not identical, was structurally consistent in targeting the same category of installation. Not the same brand, and not the same manufacturer. What was prohibited in each city was a category, specifically passive convective thermal systems using sealed or partially sealed flue structures. To understand what that category means in practice, it helps to look at what was being removed. The Cleveland removal records are the most detailed of any city in this sequence. The city's Bureau of Inspection logged 23 removal orders between 1904 and 1909. Each entry includes a description of what was removed, its dimensions, and its date of original installation. The installations ranged from 1881 to 1903. The oldest was 23 years old when it was removed. It had been operating without incident, without a complaint, without any recorded safety failure for 23 years. 23 years of operation, no record of any problem, removed under municipal order. The log entry reads as follows: cast iron convective thermal exchanger, vertical, dual flue configuration, 14 inches diameter, installed subfloor with above-grade discharge cap. The cap. That is the object we began with. Not decorative, not maintenance. The physical evidence of a removal that happened, in some cases, more than 100 years ago, and that has been sitting on that building's roofline, bolted shut ever since. Consider how many of those caps are on buildings in your city right now. Cleveland's 23 removal orders represent a fraction of the total. The log covers only buildings that were formally inspected and found in violation. Self-reported removals, voluntary removals, made after the ordinance passed, but before inspection, are not in this log. The building inspector's report for 1905 estimated that Cincinnati had between 40 and 60 installations of this category operating at the time the 1902 ordinance took effect. The removal orders on file number 11. The gap between 40 and 11 is not explained in any subsequent document. But in Minneapolis, where records are more complete, a 1910 survey by the city's Mechanical Inspection Division found 31 installations subject to the new ordinance. Removal orders were filed for 19. The remaining 12 properties were resurveyed in 1912. Of those 12, 4 had already removed the apparatus voluntarily. 8 had not. Those 8 received removal orders in 1912. The apparatus in all 8 was transported to the city's impound yard. None of it was returned to the property owners. Where the apparatus went after impound is not in the Minneapolis city records. The impound yard was cleared in 1914, 2 years after the last seizure, as part of a general municipal housekeeping effort. The ordinances that prohibited passive thermal apparatus in these cities did not prohibit gas-fired boilers. They did not prohibit coal furnaces. They did not prohibit the installation of electric resistance heating. Each of those alternatives required a recurring fuel purchase, a meter, a utility account, or some combination. Each generated ongoing revenue for a supplier. The passive thermal systems that were removed generated no such revenue. They were purchased once, installed once, and after that they consumed no metered fuel and maintained no recurring billing relationship with any supplier. Several of them had been in continuous operation for more than 20 years at the time of removal, with no fuel cost, no utility bills, and no ongoing billing relationship with any energy supplier. The building codes that emerged between 1902 and 1917 did not address that economic relationship explicitly. The language was technical and regulatory. It was written in the vocabulary of safety and standardization. But safety citations require incidents. Standardization justifications require the identification of non-standard conditions. In the public record across all 14 cities, there is no documented incident attributed to passive thermal apparatus that predates the prohibiting ordinance. There was no fire, no structural failure, no injury, and no complaint from an occupant in any city's record preceding the ordinance that prohibited these systems. In Detroit, the 1906 code revision was accompanied by a public bulletin from the Bureau of Buildings. The bulletin explained the new restrictions. The justification offered was not safety. It was described as necessary for the orderly standardization of building systems in alignment with modern municipal infrastructure. Modern municipal infrastructure. In 1906, the municipal infrastructure being standardized was electrical. The meters were going in, the lines were going up, and billing accounts were being opened across every city in this sequence. The timing of the standardization was not arbitrary. There are things in this record that can be verified by anyone with access to a municipal archive, a probate court, or a university library. The ordinances are public documents. The removal logs are public documents. The probate records, the patent filings, the personnel histories, all of it is accessible. What is not accessible is the content of the 1,903 correspondence between Holloway and Crane and the company whose letterhead read Edison General Electric Co., New York. We do not know what was in those letters. We know they were retained as active correspondence for more than 10 years after the sender's company changed its name. We know the cities where Holloway and Crane worked subsequently passed code language that served a specific market interest. We know the timing. What we do not know is whether this was coordination or coincidence. The word coincidence has a technical meaning in historical analysis. It means two things happening at the same time without a causal relationship. Establishing coincidence requires the absence of a mechanism connecting the events. In this case, the mechanisms are documented. The people connecting the events are named. The dates are verifiable. What is absent is the explicit instruction, the document, if it exists, that says in plain language what was intended. Historians call this a gap in the record. It is also, sometimes, called a successful destruction of evidence. The two are indistinguishable from the outside. What was passing through that opening before the cap arrived? If you found something in this video worth following further, the next one examines the patents that were filed in the 12 months immediately after the Indianapolis Ordinance passed in 1917. There were 14 of them, all describing modifications to sealed flue structures, and all filed by the same three inventors. Those inventors had not filed a single patent before 1917. That video is available now.